Dear learners, I am Christina Georgy, your academic counselor, and I welcome each and every one of you to my session. Today we will deal with Kate Chopin's Awakening. So dear learners, let me remind you that this is a specialized session based on the course code BEGE144. If you are a student of BEG, you might be studying this particular content under the course title BEGC134. So this particular lecture will be useful for both students of BEGE144 and BEGC134 respectively. I suppose I made it clear to you. As per the request of many of our learners, this particular session will be recorded by me, and yet another learner request was to make this a bilingual session. We have many learners attending this, so this will be a bilingual session. There will be occasional instances of Malayalam explanation, the regional language explanation as well. So shall we proceed to Kate Chopin's Awakening? Thank you. You can ask me if there is anything you are not sure about so that I can explain. So in our previous session, we discussed some basic aspects regarding Kate Chopin's Awakening. So with respect to our particular study material, we discussed the first two units. That is Unit 1 titled Locating the Awakening, where we discussed some of the basic background and contexts with respect to Kate Chopin's Awakening. Thereafter, we looked at Unit 2 of Block 2 titled Contextualizing Kate Chopin's The Awakening. So it is here that we looked at Edna Pundlier and Kate Chopin, and we discussed the Creole background and some features with respect to reading this novel with respect to a biographical approach. So today what we will do is we will straight away move on to the next unit, that is Unit 3 of Block 2 of your course book. By course book I mean your study material. So critical responses to the awakening. Here we look at the facts around the publication and reception history of the awakening. Just a minute, I'll also explain in Malayalam. As such a question വരത്തില്ല, പക്ഷേ ഒന്ന് അറിഞ്ഞിരിക്കണം, കാരണം ഏതെങ്കിലും എസ്സേയിലൊക്കെ ചിലപ്പോൾ ഇതൊക്കെ എഴുതേണ്ടി വരും. ക്രിട്ടിക്കൽ അപ്രോച്ചസ് എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ എന്താണ്, ഓരോ ആൾക്കാർ ഈ വർക്കിനെ കുറിച്ച് പറഞ്ഞ അഭിപ്രായങ്ങളാണ് കേട്ടോ. സോ വി ഷുഡ് ഓൾസോ സ്റ്റഡി ദാറ്റ്. Firstly, let's look at the first session given here, that is Critical History of the Awakening. In our last session, we understood that deliberate efforts were made in order to ignore discussions regarding the themes present in this particular novel. Speaking about the themes, in our last session we discussed themes such as infidelity, women's desire for self-definition, independence and sexual liberty, challenging the institution of motherhood. All these were quite rebellious in those times in which this particular novel was written. But we also know that at a later point in time, this novel received enormous attention. Right? So, it is more or less very obvious that the writer and this novel were much ahead of the time they were historically located in. So in that sense, the awakening was considered completely transgressive and unacceptable in the 19th century. So we can more or less guess that the criticism related to this novel wouldn't be that great, especially if it's written around the year of publication. Remember Emily Toth? Who's Emily Toth? She was one of the biographers of Kate Chopin. Remember that? So when this person read this novel for the very first time, this happened in the year 1970. Remember 1970, and this novel was written in the year 1899, and the biographer read this novel only after almost a decade, that is only in 1970. Even then, she was astonished that a woman, that too in 1899, had asked the same questions that the women's movements of then, women's movements of that time I'm referring to Emily Todd's time, were asking. That is, after 70 years, almost 70 years, these questions were asked in public. And guess, by the time it was written, there were no means of addressing such issues. That is why she was totally astonished. There is another French academic named Cyril. So he rediscovered the novel and wrote about it in the year 1946, and also translated this particular novel into French in the year 1953. Remember, somebody translated this work into French, that too in the year 1953. എല്ലാവർക്കും ക്ലിയർ ആയിട്ട് മനസ്സിലാവുന്നുണ്ടോ? ഇല്ലെങ്കിൽ ചോദിക്കണം കേട്ടോ. യെസ്. And he claimed that this work was an American Madame Bovary. So if you know this, Madame Bovary is a novel by Flaubert, and it is famous for the examination of the psychological nuances of the main character of this particular novel. So this particular person, Cyril, he has more or less compared this particular novel, The Awakening, with Madame Bovary, and he also claims that this is an American version of the novel. The time of the novel's rebirth, by rebirth we are referring to the time in which it was more or less discussed in public domain. So it was also crucial as it coined with the second wave of the feminist movement. So it was during this time that the second wave of feminism was very much active. If you are aware of feminism, you must be having an idea that there were three main waves of feminism. So it was during the second wave that such rebirth happened, and the readership for Kate Chopin was now ready, and the feminists claimed the novel immediately. That is, the feminists of the era took up the novel and discussed it. One of the major reasons is that they understood that this novel reflected in it all the important concerns such as women's independence, liberty, self-definition, and even sexuality. Remember, this novel was reprinted several times in the year 1970. That is also something that you should remember. In short, we understand that The Awakening has made a long journey. That is, firstly, it was completely forgotten. Later, it became vastly popular. And now we can say it is also canonized. That is, it is a part of several courses being taught to students all over the world. Literature courses, courses on feminist theory, women's writing, 19th century studies, American studies, textual linguistics, women's studies, and so on. So it is an integral part of the postgraduate syllabi at universities, and now we are studying this as part of our IGNO studies, right? Is it clear? Yes. Moving on to a brief summary of 19th century and early critical responses. Almost all critics of The Awakening thought that the protagonist of this work was morally offensive. Who's the protagonist of this work? Yes, Edna. Alright? Yes. Wonderful. So Francis Porcher, he was a critic who was full of praises for the style and description of this particular novel. But he termed Edna's passion as ugly, cruel, and loathsome monster. That is, it was not in a very positive light that he criticized this particular novel. I think it is a she. It was not in a very positive light that this novel has been criticized by Francis Porcher. Then we have a mention regarding Chopin's very first biographer, the name of the very first biographer of Chopin is Daniel Rankin. So this person said complimentary things about her art. So this person also thought the novel was exotic in setting, morbid in theme, and erotic in motivation. By the term exotic, what we mean is that this novel displays characteristics of a foreign or a distant land. Maybe, see, those erotic aspects or the themes that are mentioned in this particular novel are not at all relatable to the people of those times. That is what is intended here. What do you mean by the term morbid? It more or less means abnormal or unhealthy. Yes. And erotic, I suppose you know what erotic means, causing sensual or sexual desires for that matter. So Daniel Rankin, the very first biographer, thought this particular novel, The Awakening, is exotic in setting, morbid in theme, and erotic in motivation. In fact, we can say that most of the reviews praise the novel for its skillful storytelling and style perhaps. But all the reviewers, I would say almost all the reviewers, saw the theme as immoral and the portrayal of Edna as disagreeable, unrefined, and even vulgar. Alright? Some of the criticisms were that if the youth of the era read such matter, that would promote unholy imaginations and unclean desires in them. Yes. Another criticism was that this novel displays disagreeable glimpses of sexuality, and some say it's not a healthy book. Yes, things like that. It's given in your study material. When you have time, you can read about it. When we look at the first half of the 20th century, we can more or less say that The Awakening disappears completely from the literary scene. Not many discussions happened during this time. There is this person, Joseph Reilly, who suggested that a dozen stories selected from Chopin's two collections of short fiction would create a single work. During this time, attention was given to the short stories written by Kate Chopin. Yes. Now let's move on to the mid-century critical responses, that is until the novel's rebirth in 1969. Okay, what happened during this period? We already discussed that towards the end of 1960s, people began to discuss, feminists began to take up this novel, remember? Yes. So before that, American critics began to recognize The Awakening was an important literary work. There is this person, Van Brooks, who called the novel the one novel of the 90s in the South that should have been remembered. Alright? And Kenneth Abel, he called it a first-rate novel. The mid-century then saw many American critics engaging positively with The Awakening, calling Chopin's text an anachronistic, lonely, existential voice out of the mid-20th century. What do you mean by anachronistic? It means belonging to a period than this work is being published. That is far ahead of time. Similar meaning is implied here. Alright? Yes. There is also modern critical interpretations. That is, critics began to see The Awakening as a crucial literary statement about what? About a woman and her quest. By quest, it means journey towards emancipation. Emancipation means mojana. It more or less refers to freedom. Okay? Emancipation from traditional and stereotypical gender roles of the then conservative society. Linda Huff, she believes Edna lives as a new woman in an old society. She belongs to an old society, but she is indeed a new woman. That is what she says. Emily Toth, remember who this is? The biographer. So this person saw Edna as embodying 19th century feminist criticism. Yes, that is also an important point. Okay. Now we'll interpret the awakening with respect to some popular criticisms. Before that, I know this is going to be a bit rough because we are listening to the criticisms of some popular critics of the era. So let me also explain this in our regional language. ഇപ്പം നമ്മൾ എന്താ പറഞ്ഞതെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ ഇത് എഴുതിയ കാലം തൊട്ട് ഇതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് ആൾക്കാർ സംസാരിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. ആദ്യകാലത്ത് മൊത്തം നെഗറ്റീവായിരുന്നു. പിന്നെ പതുക്കെ ഒരു 1960s ഒക്കെ അടുപ്പിച്ച് കുറച്ച് പേരൊക്കെ നന്നായിട്ട് പറഞ്ഞു തുടങ്ങി. പിന്നെ ഫെമിനിസ്റ്റ് അതിനെ ഏറ്റെടുത്തു. അത് കഴിഞ്ഞ് 1969 തൊട്ട് ഇപ്പം നോക്ക് 2022 നമ്മളിത് പഠിക്കുന്നു. ഓക്കെ, കാലം മാറിയതനുസരിച്ച് ഇതൊക്കെ കുറച്ചുകൂടെ സമൂഹത്തിൽ ഫെമിലിയറായ ടോപ്പിക്സ് ആവാൻ തുടങ്ങി. അങ്ങനെ ഇത് ആൾക്കാർ ഡിസ്കസ് ചെയ്യാൻ തുടങ്ങി. ആദ്യം ഞാൻ കുറേ പേരെടുത്ത് അവരെന്തൊക്കെയാണ് പറഞ്ഞതെന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞു. അപ്പോൾ മേജറായിട്ട് ഡൗട്ട് വരേണ്ട സാധനങ്ങളൊക്കെ ഞാൻ അപ്പം തന്നെ പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട്. സോ ക്ലിയർ ആണോ? ക്ലിയർ ആണെങ്കിൽ ഞാൻ പ്രൊസീഡ് ചെയ്യാം. So let's quickly discuss the interpretations. That is, this work is considered as if an example of naturalistic fiction. Okay, so said Donald Pfizer. So he was also another critic who said so. Then this essay that he had written, it's mentioned in your textbook. In this particular essay, as we discussed earlier, comparison has been made with Flaubert's Emma Bovary. Yes. Stephen Heath, he points out the following, that is the theme of lesbianism hinted at through the portrayal of Mademoiselle. That is, it is said that when we read it, there are traces of lesbianism, that is woman to woman love, that is seen, traces of it seen in this novel. Then the significance of storytelling, and in both novels the predominance of images of birds. You know, bird imagery is very much significant. I would say symbolism with respect to birds. Yes, we will discuss that in the next unit. And also the motive of flight. What do you mean by the term motive? It refers to a recurrent theme in a particular novel. So Stephen Heath draws attention to the parrot. There is a parrot mentioned in this novel. If you read it, you will understand. So this parrot speaks a language which nobody understood, and this in a way suggests the problem of representation that Chopin faces. Yes. This novel has also been reviewed in the tradition of American literature, that is being about a search for self and the theme of conflict between the individual and society, etc. In the case of this particular novel, these themes are further problematized by the facts of maternity and motherhood. So a critique named Ivy has raised many genre questions about the differences in a romance written by a woman, and it raises the question of whether a woman may be the hero of a romance. Very usual scenario is that often a male becomes the hero of a romance, right? So can a woman become the hero of a romance is the question that is addressed here. So far we looked at a lot of critical aspects and perspectives and criticisms with respect to this particular novel. Responses to this novel was not at all positive. It was more or less negative in nature. But later, towards the end of 1960s, people began to reconsider this work, and after 1969 there came a rebirth to this particular novel, and people started to interpret it, provide positive criticism to this novel, and so on and so forth. Alright, so that's about the journey of this particular novel. Moving on to the last unit of this particular block, it is titled Critical Approaches to the Awakening. Here we look at feminist and psychoanalytical approaches respectively. So is it clear so far? Yes, glad. Alright, So we'll move on to the next unit. Here we'll discuss two prominent literary theories. Alright, literary theory is basically the lens through which we read a particular work of art. That is, if we are looking at a work in literature which deals with a female character, then naturally the theory that we will employ there would certainly be feminist theory, right? If it is regarding class struggle or aspects such as class, socialism, etc., then we might make use of Marxism in order to explain this particular work, right? Similarly, in order to understand the deep insights and nuances of a particular character, we might employ the psychoanalytical theory. Am I making sense to you? മനസ്സിലാവുന്നുണ്ടോ? ഓരോ വർക്കും പഠിക്കാൻ നമ്മൾ അതുമായിട്ട് ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട എന്തെങ്കിലും ഒരു തിയറി വെച്ചാണ് അതിനെ ഇൻ്റർപ്രറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഇപ്പോൾ സ്ത്രീകളെക്കുറിച്ചുള്ള എന്തെങ്കിലും ഒരു വർക്കാണെങ്കിൽ ഉടനെ ഫെമിനിസ്റ്റ് തിയറി നമ്മൾ എടുത്തുകൊണ്ട് വരും. ഇപ്പം മാർക്സിസത്തിനെ കുറിച്ച് എല്ലാവർക്കും അറിയാമല്ലോ. എന്തെങ്കിലുമൊക്കെ സോഷ്യലിസം അതൊക്കെ വന്നാൽ നമ്മൾ മാർക്സിസ്റ്റ് തിയറി ആയിരിക്കും ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നത്. ആ തിയറി പഠിക്കും, അതൊരു BA ലെവലിൽ പഠിക്കുന്നില്ലെന്നാണ് ഞാൻ മനസ്സിലാക്കുന്നത്. MA ലെവലിലൊക്കെ അത് പഠിക്കത്തുള്ളൂ. ഇപ്പം നിങ്ങളെ സഹായിക്കാനായിട്ട് ആ തിയറി എന്താണെന്ന് ഇവിടെ ചെറുതായിട്ട് പറഞ്ഞു തന്നിട്ടുണ്ട് ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ബുക്കിൽ. Is that clear? Any doubts you can ask if you have any? Yeah, I suppose you understood, alright? Yes. So firstly, I'll give you an introduction to feminism. So this particular term, feminism, I'm very sure that each and every one of you is familiar with this particular term. This refers to a wide range of socio-political movements and ideologies. So the basic fundamental belief in feminism is that all genders have equal rights and equal opportunities. So we can say that feminism refers to the advocacy of women's right on the ground of the equality of the sexes. Yes. So if we look at feminist critical theory, much of this theory is derived from the works of Simon de Beauvoir. So if you have your textbook with you, mark this name. It's very crucial and very significant. Simon de Beauvoir is a French feminist, and she is well known in literary parlance for her one seminal work, that is one seminal work which is titled The Second Sex. The Second Sex. So as you can guess, this particular work, The Second Sex, is about women and their rights, because women is always considered as if the second sex, that is the first is man and then comes women. That is what she mentions. Who? Simon de Beauvoir advocates such aspects in this work, The Second Sex, published in the year 1949. So Beauvoir's main contention was that when men were associated with humanity, then women were relegated to a lesser space. That is, the importance given to men was never given to women. That is what she says. So there were critics after Beauvoir also. So those who came after Beauvoir strengthened this debate put forth by Beauvoir. How did they do so? They did that by focusing on language as a tool of male dominance. According to them, language was a tool for male dominance. One reason could be those times most of these works were written by men. Nowadays we have very many women writers, but those days it was mainly men. If at all some woman wrote novels, she would have used some pseudonyms. You must have heard of pseudonyms, right? False names that people used to employ while writing works of art. Yes, pen name, correct. So there is another critic. Her name is Helen Sixou. Pronunciation might be a bit difficult for you. Her name is Helen Sixou. Okay, the other person was Simon de Beauvoir. Beauvoir, that is how it's pronounced. So Helen Sixou is another critic, feminist critic and theorist, I would say. So she tried to look at the essential connection between women's body whose sexual pleasure has been repressed and women's writing. That is, connection between women's body and women's writing has been addressed by Helen Sixou. So now let's look at the feminist issues depicted through the character of the protagonist, that is Edna. So these issues include the notion of women being viewed as personal property by the men in the novel. The very quintessential example is the case of the husband. Remember Mr. Pontelier? So he used to consider Edna as if his own personal property. That is, he wanted her to behave the way he wanted to, more or less. For instance, if you look at the time period and the culture, there are numerous instances that indicate that men simply thought of their wives as personal property. And the fact is that they could not even conceive that their wives were independent human beings with a mind of their own, as in case with Edna Pontelier. If you look at Edna, she is very helpless. Until she becomes awakened, she feels a sense of hopelessness and she is more or less entrapped in her marriage. We discussed all these aspects in our last session. Remember, the awakening of Edna had drastic consequences. Okay? As a consequence, she had to face a lot. And this ultimately results in a suicide. Remember the way she walked into the sea? Remember? Yes. So we can say that the awakening is also a very good illustration of how society enforces the norms of conventionality. The patriarchal society very often forces people to adapt themselves to the conventions of the society, right? So this happens by isolating anybody who dares defy these norms, and particularly if a woman does so, she will face consequences. That is what the novel speaks about. So this novel also depicts very clearly how society imposes these norms and how some women such as Adele find both economic as well as social reward in conforming to the aspects of the society. While on the other hand, Edna does not do so, and society finds this non-conformity a sign of rebellion. So this study material also speaks about how the society punishes those rebels through isolation and by restricting their freedom. When we look at Edna, after this awakening, she has become a changed woman. Her artistic as well as sexual desires are important, whereas tradition and conventionality are seen as those imposed upon her, and therefore trust upon women are not desirable. That is what is said here. Edna also emerges as a character who takes control of her own life. Post-awakening, this happens, and her own feelings as someone who wishes escape from the confines of marriage, domesticity, and even motherhood. Such aspects are effectively addressed in this novel. So this explains the awakening from a feminist point of view. So is that clear so far? This is important. Yes, I'd also like to remind you that this particular unit is the most important unit from this whole block. When you look at this entire block, unit 4 is the most important unit. I would say so because, see, the essay questions. One essay question would certainly be to analyze K. Chopin's The Awakening from either a feminist perspective or a psychoanalytical perspective. So if you study this one unit, you'll more or less be able to write an entire essay. I wouldn't say entire essay because I told you how to frame your answer in my last class, right? So you should give a brief introduction regarding the author. For that matter, you'll have to have a deep understanding of units 1 and 2. And next comes the background, remember? Yes, for that too, you need to refer to the other 2 units. And thereafter, if it is feminism that is mentioned in the question paper, then you will have to write something, more or less a paragraph regarding feminism. It's already given in your study material itself. Thereafter, you can give your interpretations and explanations. And in the 5th paragraph, if there is any critical response that we studied in the 3rd unit, which corresponds to this particular idea, then you can make use of that there. And finally, you can conclude your answer. I told you a tip how to conclude by lifting the words from the question paper itself. Hence, by writing hence, you can conclude your answer. So that would give you a wonderfully structured essay for say 20 marks, I believe. So is that clear? This is one question that you can go prepared when you attend your TEE. What about the rest of you? Yes. Good. So we'll move on to the next one, that is psychoanalytical approach to the awakening. Psychoanalysis. Whenever you hear this very particular term, there must be one theoretician, a psychoanalyst who would come to your mind. I'm very sure that yes, you know it. You know that name. It's Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud. He was a psychoanalyst by profession. He was an Austrian psychoanalyst. So we can say that the psychoanalyst or psychoanalytical approach to literature derives mostly from the work of the Austrian psychoanalyst named Sigmund Freud. We can say that he was the pioneer of psychoanalytical criticism. What do you mean by the term pioneer? That is one of the most significant figures, most important person when we think of psychoanalytical criticism. Have you heard of the ego and superego? If not, I'll explain. I'll explain in English first. Yes, you must have studied when you learned Scarlet Letter. I remember explaining this last year also. So I'll explain in English first. Basically, Freud has identified 3 components of human psyche, namely the id, the ego and the superego. So the id tries you to get to do things. It operates through pleasure principle. That is, say, okay, this example, make sure that you don't write this example for your examination. This is just for your understanding that I'm mentioning this. That is, if you are sick and you crave for an ice cream, you'll feel like, oh, I need this ice cream. Or if you are on a diet, if you are trying to lose weight, you know that if you eat this ice cream, you'll put on and it's high calorie. So that thought that you'll put on and it is not right to do this now is what is called your superego. So the superego works on moral grounds, morality. Okay? And it is what makes you feel like eating this ice cream. So it works on pleasure principle. And there is ego which balances both these. And ego works between these two. That is between pleasure principle and morality principle. So we call ego as reality principle. So I'll put it in better terms. That is, id operates through pleasure principle, whereas superego operates through morality principle. So id and superego are always in constant fight with each other, and it is ego that steps in between these two. That is, ego steps in between superego and id, and finally some compromise is made. With respect to the example that I gave, finally we'll decide that it's better not to have the ice cream, or else I'll put on, and that would be a much more better choice not to have the ice cream. Okay, does that make sense to you? Were you able to follow me? I think this is the suitable example that I could give at the moment. Yes. You don't have to know all these details. It's not mentioned in your study material. In your study material, it's just mentioned that Freud identified 3 components of the human psyche. That is the id, ego and superego. That's all that you need to know. Alright. Yes. So, Freud also mentions this repressed wishes and fears that every individual has. According to him, what do you mean by the term repressed? It means suppressed. Okay. So according to Freud, these repressions are then manifested in the form of dreams, in language as the Freudian slip, and in creative activity that, according to Freud, may produce art, and in neurotic behavior also. So according to Sigmund Freud, human beings experience repressed wishes and fears which manifests itself in the form of dreams. It is said that most of the contents of the dreams that we have are actually based on our repressed or suppressed wishes or fears, for that matter. For some, it could be some dreams about their aspirations. For some, it could be some traumatic memories or fears. So all these are mentioned by Freud. So he also talks about the Oedipus complex, and he used the analysis of dreams as a tool for uncovering our repressed feelings and memories. So have you heard of the Oedipus complex? No, I suppose. So I shall explain, since it's mentioned in your study material. You can say it refers to the complex emotions aroused in a young child by an unconscious sexual desire for the parent of the opposite sex. See, the term was essentially applied to boys, and the equivalent for girls is called Electra complex. That is, if a young boy develops such feelings towards the mother, it was called Oedipus complex by Freud. And if it is a young girl who is experiencing that towards the father, then it is called Electra complex. Remember, it was named after the story of Oedipus. You all are students of English language and literature. At some point or the other, you must have heard about or read about Oedipus, right? So it's the story about King Oedipus, a man who unknowingly killed his father and slept with his mother. Yes, he married his mother. So even if it is unknowingly, he developed some desire, sexual affection towards the mother, right? It is the same Oedipus after whom this complex is named. Clear? Yes. So we already spoke about Freud. Later came other critics such as Carl Jung. So he is an analytical psychologist, and it is he who developed a theory called the collective unconscious. That is, according to him, the collective unconscious, a repository of shared unconscious memories dating back to the origins of literature, was important. Another mention is the French theorist Lacan, Jacques Lacan. So he focuses more on language and language related issues. It is he who extended Freud's theory of dreams, literature and their interpretation. Just for your knowledge, Lacan identifies 3 stages of development, namely pre-Oedipal stage, then the mirror stage and the I stage. The pre-Oedipal stage is also called the pre-verbal stage. It is the stage before which a child develops verbal ability. Then comes the mirror stage or imaginary stage. It is the stage in which the child faces himself or herself in the mirror and identifies himself or herself. And basically the last stage, that is the I stage, the stage in which language and society and aspects regarding such matters are understood or comprehended by the child. So you don't have to study this aspect in detail. I emphasized because that is mentioned in your study material. So this serves as an introduction to your understanding to the psychological approach to the awakening. From the TE perspective, when they ask you to examine this text from a psychological perspective, you will have to write all these, especially the main points, as if a paragraph before the analysis of the text from this perspective. So to read the awakening from the psychoanalytical perspective, you need to be aware of the symbolism in awakening. I suppose it's clear so far, right? Should I explain further? No, right? മനസ്സിലായോ എല്ലാവർക്കും? So what we are about to study now is also part of the psychoanalytical reading of the text. Okay. So in our last session we studied that symbols may be objects, characters, figures or even colors, and these are used to represent ideas or concepts. So if we look at awakening, there are also many symbols used. The most common symbols are the symbol of birds and the symbol of the sea. If you remember, we also mentioned this last class. Nevertheless, I'll take a few minutes to explain this in detail because I believe this is quite important for your TEE. So, very often we use birds to either denote freedom, or if it is a caged bird, it denotes imprisonment. Yes, a bird who stays within cage, that can be a symbol, an image of entrapment. So it is the same idea that is seen in the awakening. The caged birds signify Edna's own entrapment. By entrapment, what do we mean? We mean the lack of freedom, that is restrictions imposed upon Edna. So she had been restricted within her marriage, and she had been, put into a world where it was just her marriage, her husband and children. So it could also be indicative of the entrapment of not just Edna but all women of the Victorian era. We already saw Madame Lebrun's parrot. Okay, we spoke about one parrot who speaks language that is not understood by anybody, and there is also this mockingbird, and they could be looked upon as signifying Edna and Madame Rees respectively. Both the birds are in captivity, their movements are restricted. Similarly, the movement of the women in the novel too are restricted and limited by the conventions and traditions laid down by society. If we look at Edna, she is not able to articulate her innermost anguish, not even to her husband. She tries to escape from the narrow confines of society, that is the domesticity of her marriage and her children. So it is for that matter that she sets up the pigeon house. Remember the small house? Yes. The small house that she more or less sets up for herself. Yes, it's the same pigeon house that is mentioned. And also there is this final imagery of the bird in the text that more or less denotes Edna's suicide at the end of the novel. So you must be having an idea regarding the bird imagery and symbolism used in this particular work. To explain it in Malayalam, ഒരു കൂട്ടിലിട്ട കിളി എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ എപ്പോഴും ഒരു എൻട്രാപ്മെൻ്റ് ആയിരിക്കും. എൻട്രാപ്മെൻ്റ് എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ മലയാളത്തിൽ എന്താ നമ്മൾ പറയുന്നത്, ബന്ധനമാണ്. കൂട്ടിലടച്ചിട്ടിരിക്കുന്ന ഒരു അവസ്ഥയായിരുന്നു ഈ എഡ്നയ്ക്ക്. So to look at the next symbol, that is the symbol of the sea. See, we have seen many authors who have used the symbol of the sea. For example, if you have heard of The Old Man and the Sea, it is actually a novella written by Hemingway. And there is also this famous novel Moby Dick, written by Herman Melville. So these novels make use of the same symbol of the sea. The sea may be said to be signaling a sense of space, boundless and timeless, a sense of freedom from life's shores, and hence from the trials and tribulations of life. It is interesting to note that Edna has tried learning swimming unsuccessfully earlier, but she is taught by Robert. Remember who Robert was? Yes, the love interest of Edna. And later she learns to swim and feels the sea and the surf beckoning her throughout the novel. She is said to be seduced by the sound of the surf. It is also mentioned in the study material. So Mrs. Pontellier, that is Edna, was beginning to realize her position in the universe as a human being and to recognize her relations as an individual in the world within and about her after this awakening. So if we look at the sea as water, then we can also realize that the sea then symbolizes a Christian concept of cleansing. That is, we call this baptism, or the concept of rebirth. That is also denoted here. It is therefore apt that Edna should drown or swim away to her death, symbolizing her rebirth, a rebirth of sorts. May that be with respect to all the limitations that she suffered in the society in which she lived. So to sum up what we have learned today we looked at units 3 and 4 of block 2 of this particular course code. Initially, we studied some of the critical responses to this particular novel. Initially, they were mostly negative, and after 1969, most of the reviews and comments were mostly positive in nature. Thereafter, we studied the approaches to the awakening, critical approaches, namely feminist approach and psychoanalytical approach. In psychoanalytical approach, we looked at the symbolism employed in this particular novel as such. I also told you that it is mandatory for you to give due importance to the last unit of this particular block because most prominently the essay question will be from this unit. For that matter, you should also incorporate aspects from the other unit. I have also told you how to frame an essay answer effectively. I hope I made it clear to you. So that's all for today. We'll meet again next day.